Okay, everyone, welcome back to the Integrated Athlete Podcast. Today, I've got a super special guest, and I know I probably say this about every guest that we have on, but today we have Sam Gilbert. So Sam has a really, really diverse and strong background in the worlds of physiotherapy, in the worlds of strength and conditioning. He runs his own business, which is a multidisciplinary health clinic and gym in Tokyo, Japan, and he lives in Tokyo, Japan as well. He's also a very highly accomplished martial artist in the world of Kyokushin karate, most recently a BJJ practitioner as well. And he is an author. So Sam has authored an amazing book, The Science of Striking, which is just a phenomenal resource. And he's also the host of the Tokyo Living podcast as well. So big welcome, Sam.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Daniel, and congratulations on starting a podcast and what you've done with it so far. It's not an easy thing. It's a big step, and it's something that takes a certain amount of confidence and preparation and organisation and a lot of behind the scenes stuff that a lot of people that don't do this sort of thing don't know about. So congratulations, and it's an honour to be on as a guest.
Awesome, mate. Yeah, thank you very, very much. And I highly agree with you there. I think you look at a lot of podcasts and you think to yourself, how much work could it be or how hard could it be? And then you look at all the stuff you've actually got to do in the background. And it's quite a bit of work. But again, I think it's a beautiful format of getting information out and sharing different people's knowledge and something, that we've never really had before. So it's cool to see it get really popular.
Yeah. And I sort of started listening to podcasts 2005, pretty soon after I arrived in Japan. And it's always been a resource that I've relied on heavily. I probably listen to, 10 to 15 podcasts a week. A lot of them are sort of shorter format, maybe 20, 30-minute podcasts, up to an hour. The occasional longer one, I know sort of the more popular podcasts, Rogan and Huberman type podcasts that hours on end. But I like to listen to a lot of content, various, obviously physio and training and martial arts, but also business and self-development stuff. And I think it's a fantastic medium, and most people will have a commute as part of their day, and I think it's a great way to utilise those commutes.
Yeah, awesome. Such a nice way of just getting education in when you otherwise couldn't, right? So that's cool. So, Sam, if you could just begin with a bit of a background, mate. I think, again, like a lot of people potentially listening know of you or know who you are. But again, there's always going to be a few people that don't know who you are. If you could just give everyone a bit of a background of your formative years, what life was like growing up for you, what eventually got you, into martial arts and fitness and what you do for work now as a physio and a strength and conditioning coach.
Okay, I'll try and get through this as quick as possible and make it as succinct and try and draw in the different elements that led to what I'm doing now. But I grew up in Ballarat, which is a country town in Australia. For those listeners listening outside Australia, I started karate when I was 8. I think it was just a fascination with wanting to learn how to fight. I think that's as simple as it was. I think it was influenced by watching movies. Van Damme was probably my biggest hero growing up. Watched all the Karate Kid movies. I guess that sort of sparked a bit of fascination with Japan as well. I think that one of the most ironic parts of my life is that I now live opposite Mr. and Mrs. Miyagi. I have the Miyagis as my neighbours. I started karate when I was 8, with the sole purpose of becoming the next Van Damme or a real life version of Van Damme, and that sort of carried through as part of it. But I think very early on, I realised that was not only a way of learning combat, but also a fantastic sport. So I got into the competitive aspect fairly quickly as well, and that sort of gradually took over. Still. Looking at my my love of sort of action heroes and things like that, I also started to appreciate physicality and the physical characteristics that strong people had. And there was one particular, I can't remember which movie it is, one of Arnie's movies where he walks into a room and there's one guy from each side coming in to attack him, and he literally just pushes them, both of them, out to the side simultaneously. And that stuck in my mind for some reason. It's like, I want to be that strong, that no one can touch me. So I started just ad hoc lifting weights or any weighted object I could find. My parents still make fun of me. Like, we had like this toy cash register, which is actually made out of iron. Like it was probably a couple of kilos. And then I think I got like a pumpkin or a grapefruit or something, and tied one of those to either end of a broomstick and tried lifting that. And then eventually my mum bought like a 1.5 kilo weight and then a 3 kilo weight. And I was just sort of lifting those at home. And eventually, like, as soon as I was old enough to, I got mum to take me to a gym, and she took me to the Ballarat University gym, where they actually had, the gym instructors were not just kids sitting in the corner of a gym looking at their phone, which is often the case, but these guys are actually human movement students, and they actually were fairly good with teaching me proper technique and all that sort of thing. So those sort of things paralleled. I got really into the sports side of karate, but was also really interested in physical development and strength training. I was competing, obviously, in those days. For those listeners who are from a full contact karate background, in Victoria, in the state where I grew up in, we weren't actually able to practice knockdown rules. So I did more of a point system karate, which is similar to an Olympic style karate, but it was actually non-contact, which was not really what I wanted to do, but was the only thing that I could do. But I think it was actually quite useful in terms of developing slightly different techniques and strategies, which are still useful today. I think my instructor, who was a previous guest on your podcast, Johan Peter Volk, always talked about the British national team, who was sort of fairly dominant, not dominant, but they were a very strong country in the late 80s and early 90s. And guys like Michael Thompson and Nick DaCosta, they always practiced both forms. Even the guys that have come through, like Darren Stringer and those guys who just retired, famous British fighters, they all have always done both systems. And I think you can learn a lot from that point system karate. And actually, now that I do more, most of my striking practice myself is more kickboxing. Actually having a point system background has been useful for that, because you're actually looking at trying to score points and having more of an in and out and a little bit more of a footwork based approach, rather than just standing there and slogging it out, which is what I became later on in my career. But yeah, so I competed, and as soon as I was old enough to, I started competing in knockdown rules. And I guess the third part of that, somewhere along the line, I also developed a fascination for trying to fix people who were in pain as a result of whatever sporting pursuits they were involved in. So those things have sort of meshed and basically guided my life's work. When I was, so a lot of kids don't really know what they want to do. Even people in their 30s and 40s don't really know what they want to do. I think I was lucky that by the time I'd finished year 10, I knew that I wanted to be a physiotherapist. And so my last 2 years were really focused on getting into physiotherapy, which is quite a competitive course to get into, or at least it was 20 years ago when I was going through. And so, I had a real focus in terms of occupationally what I wanted to do. I also wanted to go to Japan and train. I guess it started a little bit with the whole Karate Kid and Mr. Miyagi, but being in that competitive environment and seeing and hearing about people that had spent a lot of time in Japan, guys like Judd Reed and Nick Pettis, two people I ended up becoming friends with later on, guys like Gary O'Neill, and it seemed like a lot of people that were successful in knockdown competition had spent time training in Japan, and so it sort of made sense for me to try and pursue that. When I finished school, I took a gap year and was lucky enough to be, again, through Shihan Peter Volk and Shihan Ishii, who unfortunately passed away, but it was another big mentor to me. They were able to organise a scholarship with a dojo in Kochi, in Shikoku. So I went and spent 5 months there, just training full-time, which was, I think, sped up my maturing process, both physically and emotionally and psychologically by a few years. I was 18, straight out of school and straight out of a pretty cushy living environment. I was from a country town like Ballarat. It's a lot of space, sort of upper middle class. We had a big house, very comfortable lifestyle. And then I went to Japan, where I was living in a tiny little room shared with the guy that I was training with. and he could speak really good English, but no one else could. And Kochi, where I was staying, was quite rural, and I think I probably saw 3 other foreigners the whole time that I was there. So yeah, that helped me really sort of grow up, but also improve my technical skill and my physical ability. I think I went over there at about 72 kilos and came back 5 months later at about 78 kilos. So I was able to pack on a fair bit of size, even though I was training 8 hours a day, but I was probably eating for most of the other 16. Came back and then started my physiotherapy degree the next year. Completed 4-year physio degree, and in that time actually managed to sustain a few serious injuries, which then, in my mind, put a little bit of a time sensitivity on my fighting career, how much longer I'd be able to participate. I had 2 ACL reconstructions within 18 months of each other. And so at that stage, I thought, well, the physiotherapy is always going to be there. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to. I was 23, so it wasn't like I was going to retire the next year, but there was a little bit of a time limit there. So I thought, I want to give everything I have to the sport. And so, made the move to organising another trip back to Japan. And I think also just backpedal a little bit as well. Once I started to get into the sporting aspect of karate, that sort of took over my drive or my motivation for training for most of the next 20 years. And I did a post on this a few months ago, but karate for a lot of my life has really been a sport. And so I always viewed karate in a sporting lens, and I think that sort of contributed to the rest of my life being centered around sports science and sports performance. But I was focused on trying to be successful and trying to achieve the competition goals that I had. I went to Japan. I was training again full-time in Fukuoka for about 10 months, moved to Tokyo in 2005 at the end of the year, and I've been living in Tokyo ever since. I was I was lucky enough to get a job at an expat physiotherapy practice when I arrived, which was lucky because not many physiotherapy practices will employ new grads, which I was at that time. As a business owner, I wouldn't really. I've had a policy of not employing new grad physios, so I was very lucky to be given that opportunity. Worked at that practice until I retired. So from competition, I haven't saved enough to retire from my occupation at 30. That'd be nice, but until I finished competing, and then I went about setting up my own business in collaboration with my brother-in-law. So when I was in Japan, I met my now wife, who's also Australian, and she actually came out to help her brother with his personal training business. And then they opened a beauty salon together, which she still owns and runs. And so, once we started to get serious and she'd opened the business, I realized that, we'd still be in Japan for quite a lot longer, which I was happy with. I really liked the lifestyle here and wanted to make it our home for the medium term. So her brother is a personal trainer, and it made sense. I mean, we were already working together in terms of referring clients. And so it sort of made sense at that stage for us to try and find a space where we could combine those two elements. So that we opened up Club 360. It was sort of the winter of 2011. 2012. So we got the keys in August 2012, and we had our official opening in April 2013. So in a couple of months, we'll be celebrating our 10-year anniversary. That's pretty much what I've done in a nutshell. I can sort of elaborate on any of those areas if you'd like, but that's the basics.
Yeah, nice, very nice. So you've had again quite a big, diverse background in terms of what you've been able to do and accomplish within your career so far. So if you could talk a little bit, Sam, maybe just around some of your career highlights and some of the things that you've really taken from martial arts, some of the powerful lessons that you've learned as well.
Yeah, career highlights, if you just sort of pointing at on paper, my best performance was the 2009 World Cup in Russia, which that's that trophy there behind me. And one of the things that I learned from that experience was just the whole process of breaking things down. And I mean, if we have time, we can talk a little bit about the mental aspects and the psychological skills training that's involved in tournament preparation. But leading up to that tournament, I sort of looked at the draw. There was 32 fighters, and I knew my first fight would be difficult. The guy he outweighed me by about 25 kilos, but they were only doing 2 rounds before they were going to the scales. And everyone who knew this guy and fought him said that he hits very hard but gets tired quite quickly. And so my strategy, I really just had to absorb his damage for a certain amount of time and then stick with him for 5 minutes, and then I should win on weight. And I had that sort of game plan in my head. And then I sort of looked at the way that the draw went on, and the guy and you can sort of justify these. This is one way that I'd used to sort of build confidence, was that guy had actually gone 2 extensions and had a split decision with a guy that beat the guy that I was going to fight next, and then he had beaten the guy. And I could sort of, if I know matchups make fights, but if I beat that guy, then in theory he had better performances than other people against the other people that I was going to fight. And that's exactly what happened. So I got in there. I basically was able to absorb his attacks, which weren't really that strong in the end. And I think I could probably have beaten him on the flags, but was maybe fighting a little bit conservatively to save energy. Took him to the scales and won. And then after that, I sort of had it in my head, it's like, it shouldn't really be that difficult to get through the semifinals. And at that stage, I would be fighting either Donatas Imbras, who was the top seed in that tournament, or Tsukamoto Norichika, who was my training partner and sort of one of my lifelong mentors, which that's as far as I took my imagery. So I was like, I'm going to get to the semi-finals, and then we'll see what happens. And that's exactly what happened. And I didn't have any visualization, or I didn't really think about anything from there on. And I lost the semi-final, and I think that at that stage, Tsukamoto was as gettable as he ever has been in his career. He had just gone 2 extensions and 1 on weight with Donatas Imbras, and he was pretty battered and very tired. And I think physically I could have beaten him, but there was just this massive mental block. And I couldn't do it. I think part of it was that I felt very indebted to him for, part of what I've achieved was thanks to him. He taught me an immense amount, both about fighting, just about life, and about a whole bunch of other things. And it's like, and this guy should be champion, and I don't feel like I have the right to beat him. I've got the whole Japanese team, all the branch chiefs, who already I don't think like me very much. They're all against, and the whole thing was overwhelming. And I've never had any sort of psychological block like that in my life. But it was an interesting experience. It's like, whatever you want to try and achieve, you've got to think the whole way through, and you've got to think all these different circumstances. But the fact that I was able to get there, I think, was in part due to mapping out the process and giving me these little reasons to be confident in what I could achieve. So that was a lesson. I guess one of the other lessons was that in 2004, leading up to the qualification for the World Cup, which was the following year, where we only had 1 representative in each division. And my training was going really well. And then 3 weeks out, I rolled my ankle pretty badly. And that sort of set my training back a little bit. And so that was sort of the first hurdle. But by the time I was a week out, was sore, I couldn't move 100%, but I was still confident of winning. And then a week out from the tournament, I basically, I was training in the university gym, where I was allowed to store my heavy bag, and I'd do some rounds on the heavy bag, but I have to put up and take down the bag. I put the bag on a heavy table, and then I had to pull it off the table to get to let it swing free. It basically swiveled over and landed on my toe and shattered my toe. Big toe was fractured in 5 spots. And I was just absolutely devastated. And in my mind, I'd sort of given up on that tournament. I had this image of how I wanted to go, how I wanted to fight. And then got to the day of the tournament, managed to get through to the final, but ended up losing that final fight. And I still sort of go back and think I still could have won. I still had enough weapons to get me over the line, but just mentally I sort of copped out. I sort of, rather than thinking of this being an extra challenge, there's an extra handicap put upon me, I thought of it as, this isn't fair. This isn't fair. Why is this happening to me? I've trained so hard. This isn't fair. And that's all. I couldn't sort of get past talking to myself in that way. And that's sort of, in my opinion, the reason I lost. So that was another reason. That was another learning as well, just trying to turn everything into a positive situation where you can. In terms of my fighting career, that they're probably the two biggest lessons that spring to mind at the moment.
You've touched on some really powerful points just there, particularly around, like what I've heard a lot of other people say and what some other, guests that I've had on have talked about so much is that missing piece of the puzzle for a lot of people is that mental toughness, that real self-belief. And I found it quite interesting, what you're talking about there with when you were fighting Tsukamoto was that you almost had the belief that you didn't quite deserve to win because you almost felt indebted to him as to how much he helped you and he provided you over the years and that sort of stuff. And could you maybe talk a little bit about, Sam, just about that experience of training with him? So maybe not everyone listening is actually from the karate world or that sort of thing, but, but for everyone that's not, essentially, Tsukamoto is one of the greatest full contact karate fighters of all time. It's a 2-time world champion, so really quite an achievement. So if you could talk a little bit about that, Sam, that'd be cool.
Sure. Yeah. He won the world tournament at 21 and then at 37, and he competed in those 3 world tournaments in between. So if you think about someone winning an Olympic gold medal, then competing in the next 3 Olympics without that success, and then coming back and winning an Olympic gold medal again, it's just unheard of. Incredible longevity in the sport, and he sort of transformed the sport in a way. He introduced, didn't necessarily invent different techniques, but he popularized a number of different techniques and sort of just fought in a way that was very different to most other full contact fighters. And he kept sort of progressing. So he kept changing things up and he kept experimenting, and some of those experiments went badly and weren't successful for him, but he continued to sort of revolutionize himself. And I think, in order to have such a long, successful career in a sport like ours, it's I think it's a necessary thing to do. So I had his poster on my wall when I was 14, when he first won the world tournament, and I think a couple of months after that, a few Japanese instructors did a tour to Australia, and I think that probably that's another memorable night. I can remember, there was Suzuki and Midori Shihano. It was basically the Midori tour, and then he just brought a bunch of people around. And Midori was impressive, but at the end of it, they had a few of these guys like Suzuki and a few others spar with people. So they had fighters come up and spar with them, and they had some of Australia's top fighters. And, you see someone like Suzuki stand with a good fighter, they're going to look good. They're going to look like they're in control, but they're sparring. They're not fighting. So they're not going full power, and they're not, one of Suzuki's strong points was his stamina. He could wear people down. You're going to wear people down in a sparring session. So it was impressive, and what Midori was teaching was impressive. But seeing Tsukamoto was he was on a complete, it was almost like something out of the Matrix. No one could touch him, and it was just playing with people and really good fighters. He was just playing with them. It was just, and he was 3 moves ahead, and he was throwing things that we had never seen before. So that sparked a fascination. And again, going forward, so that was early 1996. I fought him in 2009. That's still fresh in my mind. Like going in to fight him, and I've got that in the back of my mind. The poster on my wall when I was a kid. It's a massive barrier to get across. When I came to Tokyo, I always had it in my mind that I was going to train with him. I'd met him a couple of times at other tournaments when I was in Fukuoka and at the World Tournament sort of 2 years before. And when I arrived there, I've been to dojo all over Japan and all over the world, and there's just something very different about his place. It's just got a very different energy and a very different aura. And he's just the most welcoming, fun person to be with. He's just a wonderful person. he's a terrifying fighter, and even things. So when you see Tsukamoto fight, a lot of people fear that the head kicks, he's got more knockouts than probably anyone else in knockdown karate. But even his low kicks, like he's never famous for low kicks, but if you took one of his low kicks, you could only take a few. He never trained with shin pads, and a lot of his students did either. I did because I'm just injury prone, and I just wouldn't, and especially I had to wear knee pads because my knees were shot by that stage. But yeah, a couple of kicks from him, shin to thigh, and you couldn't do much else. And even but you couldn't land a punch on him, even though that wasn't really. So even though he's one of the greatest fighters of all time, I think he's even better in sparring than he ever was in tournament. So yeah, to spar with him, it was sometimes frustrating because you didn't feel like you could do much, but you were always sort of learning and downloading information at the same time. But for him, like the energy of his dojo was what really sticks with me. And it's difficult. It's one of those things. It's difficult to describe, but he is just a very welcoming person. And a lot of Japanese dojo. When foreigners go to these certain dojo, especially with some of the Japanese instructor that doesn't really have a lot of experience with foreigners, they can be very sort of shy and almost come across as arrogant. But you go into his place and it's just extremely welcoming and just fun. We always had a lot of fun when we were training. And I think that's sort of something that stuck with me in business as well. You've got clients coming through the door. You want to create that welcoming environment. If you're going into a gym for the first time, especially if you're someone that's not had a lot of experience in gyms, or if you're going in to see a medical practitioner and you're unsure of whether you're going to get a diagnosis that's potentially threatening, or you're in pain, and just being in pain is a difficult thing for a lot of people. Having an environment that is welcoming and that has a really positive energy, will as a business, it's going to increase your retention. People are going to be happy coming in and spending time in your facility. As a client who's experiencing pain, we know that the first impression they get will have an impact on their outcomes in terms of their response to whatever treatment interventions. And that's why I make my front desk staff aware even that, when someone comes in, you are the first person that's going to have an influence on their condition. And a lot of people don't get it, but after you explain all the things that go into pain, because, the average receptionist doesn't necessarily, or not the average person, I'm going to throw receptionist under the bus, the average person doesn't have a good understanding of pain, right? So if I say that someone's coming in for their appointment, the way that you greet them is going to influence how my exercises or my education, whatever intervention, the effect that's going to have on their knee, it sort of blows their mind. But once you explain all the things that go into pain, they can sort of start to understand it. The different parts of the brain that are unlocked when you are welcomed and you feel less threatened by an environment. You're going to be open to new information, and it makes my job as a clinician or a coach that much easier. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I've learned from Tsukamoto is just how to set up a positive environment in whatever space you happen to be functioning in.
Yeah, really important that energetic of a person, which again is the more unseen side of, I suppose, what we experience in day-to-day life, or particularly, with athletes and that sort of stuff. But it's something that, although I haven't trained with Tsukamoto before, just walking past him at overseas events and then feeling he's got a real certain energetic about him, you know what I mean? And I think a lot of top athletes, regardless of whether it's combat sports or outside of combat sports, they do have a special energy about them. And it's something that is, I think it's something quite unique. So they're really, really cool points you made there, Sam. And again, that collective energy of, like you said, how his dojo feels, right? So it's like you go there, you're training with him and his training partners and his students and that sort of stuff. But then that quality of result that you're all getting from this enhanced collective energy is really powerful, I think.
Yeah. And then if he's not there, obviously it's not quite the same, but there's still that energy there. And that's sort of what I try and, it's always a work in progress, but trying to create with staff in the facility that I own is to try and create that atmosphere. So even if I'm not there, you're still getting that sort of positive energy. And he was able to sort of achieve that within his dojo.
Yeah, really cool, Sam. Perhaps if we could just talk a little bit about how you believe sort of the culture of a country has a bit of an impact as to the athletes, the kind of athletes that it produces. So if we look at a lot of other sports, but particularly within the combat sports as well, certain Asian countries and certain Eastern European countries, as an example, they produce these really strong athletes. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, the link between the culture and the athletes that they produce.
It's a really interesting question, a fascinating question, and something that I've thought quite a lot about before. And I think that my views on it might differ from other people's. I know that when did sort of Russia come? I guess Russia as a country really sort of started to come to the forefront in full contact karate in the late 90s and then sort of into the early 2000s. And at that time, I can remember people looking at that and saying, they've come out of this. They're all tough because they come out of a tough environment. They've grown up in this, poor communist country and they've had to fight through all this adversity and that makes them the athletes that they are, and that sort of drives their success. And then you see, I think in any sport, especially in combat sports, if someone has had a tough upbringing, they'll always make a big deal about that in sort of the promo to the fight. He's come from rags to riches. You see Francis Ngannou come from, going from country to country, poor. He's from Cameroon, extremely poor, came to France, didn't have anything, was homeless, and then all of a sudden he's UFC champion, and now he's walking away because he's turned down an $8 million fight with John Jones. It's this massive rags to riches story. But they always get sort of hyped up. No one really cares about the person that comes from like a middle class background and then achieves the same level of success. But if you sort of go through, the sports book records, it'd be an interesting study to do, I think, to look at the backgrounds of athletes, because I think that, we all want to hear a good sort of rags to riches story, but a riches to slightly more riches story isn't really as entertaining. So I don't think that sort of, the background has that much to do with it. I think there's a lot of combat sports athletes that grew up in very good backgrounds, had good education, had very supportive families, and have been extremely successful. And the same can be said for other sports. We know how successful the Japanese are, especially in our sport. And Japan has a very, very high standard of living, and I don't really know any of the champions that I know that have struggled or had to overcome adversity. So I think that when we're talking about the mental side, I think that a lot of that is genetic and hereditary, and people are often just born with that ability to push themselves a lot harder than others. But I don't necessarily think that it's driven that much by the environment that they're growing up in, because most stories starting in rags end up in rags. People grow up in bad environments, and then that sticks with them the whole lives. So if that was true, if having to fight through that would make you very successful, I think that we'd see more of those stories. It's just not something that I necessarily buy. Now, when you talk about regional success, I think it's got more to do with the infrastructure around organisations and coaching bodies that make up those organisations, and I guess in some ways it can be just luck that you might have one good coach that trains a lot of successful athletes, and those athletes may go on to become good coaches themselves, which doesn't always happen, can happen, but they inspire other athletes. And as there's a bigger athlete pool, you start to get more coaches that want to get involved in coaching those athletes, and then you see an organisation grow. And I think in Lithuania that's happened. People ask me, what are some of the really strong countries in full contact karate? And I say, Lithuania is one of the strongest countries. And people are like, where is Lithuania again? It's a tiny little country, and even though Eastern Bloc, Eastern European countries tend to be very strong in general. Lithuania is a tiny little country, yet it has this massive full contact karate organization, not only in Shinkyukushin. Shinkyukushin's the biggest, obviously, but in other knockdown federations. And it just comes from a very well organized group of administrators and coaches. And I've talked, and I know some of the Lithuanian fighters, they didn't grow up in poverty. There's nothing to do with that. They grew up very well and from very good backgrounds. And some of the Russian fighters I know, some of the most successful fighters grew up actually in quite wealthy backgrounds. Well, sort of going back to that previous point, but I talked to Lucas Kubilius, who was one of my opponents. I ended up fighting 4 Lithuanians in my career, and he said, it's just all about the coaching. We just have a very, very, and he trained and competed all over the world. And he said, our coaches are just the best. They have extremely good and they coach. A lot of coaches will be fighters, and then they go on to teach what they're in the way that they've been taught, rather than actually being taught to coach, which is sort of what Lucas was talking about. They actually have a structure for bringing up instructors in Lithuania. So that's just sort of one example. And I think that there's the coaching aspect, there's the participation aspect. Whenever there's more participation in a certain sport, you see these pockets of not so much now, but Brazil in terms of the soccer and other parts of the world, where there's just these pockets of a high density of participation. You look at the MMA fighters are coming out of Dagestan. And again, when you see the promo, the last promo for the last UFC with Ankalaev, they showed, and again with they showed him in Dagestan, which, I don't want to live in Dagestan. It looks awful, but does all of Dagestan look like that? I don't know. I've never been there. I'm not going to go there. Especially now when they show the pictures of Chimaev and where he grew up in part of Russia. Anyway, again, not another place I'm going to visit. It'll come to me later. But they sort of focus on that. But for me, I'm pretty sure that the whole of Dagestan isn't full of poverty. I'm sure they don't have as high quality living as we do in Australia or Japan. But I think it's just the density of participation. And Ankalaev talked about this in his promos. Growing up, every Dagestanian kid just wants to be an athlete. He didn't talk about, we didn't have any food to eat. No, he said, we want to be champions. You've got that mindset since you were young. My brother was a wrestler. I go down and train with my brother, and and then obviously there's some extremely good technical coaching in that part of the world, and that's why you're seeing all these monsters out of this certain area. So I think there's a density of participation. I think there's coaching, and I think there's just infrastructure in terms of funding, especially in Eastern European countries and in Russia. Once a sport gets government funding behind it, then those athletes are able to train full-time. They can have full-time coaches. And that makes a big difference. If your job is just to train, there's so many more resources and time available to get to that next level. And that's what you see, when, especially in the 70s and 80s, where the Soviets were really dominant. Let's just put the steroid part to the side. But actually, it's maybe not as irrelevant. I mean, the sports that they were dominant in were the ones that the governments supported. And whether they supported them in training resources or whether they supported them in pharmaceuticals doesn't really matter. There was that support there. There was that funding. You see the funding that goes into Australian sports, like something like swimming. I'm sure our swimmers are extremely successful because they can afford to have the best facilities. They can afford the best coaches. And there's also that density of participation. We have a lot of pools, things like that. That all sort of comes in. But again, in Lithuania, I believe that they have government support for karate. And once they have that, it's a sort of green light. They can employ these coaches and then have their athletes training full time. So I think it's those three factors that will dictate if a certain region or a certain country or even a certain part of that country is successful in competition, whether it be karate or any other type of competition.
Yeah, some really profound points again that you've made there, Sam. Again, it's not just the belief of the dominant sort of culture of the country, perhaps. So, like you said, it's that resource availability. Can they train? Can they get paid to train? And then I really like the point you made around coaching, right? Like, I think a lot of people get into coaching just from being a practitioner, or just from being a fighter, or in this example. But I think the art of coaching is really, like you said, you've got to probably study coaching, whether that's, doing it through books or through other mentors and that sort of stuff. But really tapping in to really be able to help someone from a big picture point of view. I think, a lot of people instruct, but not that many people can coach effectively.
For sure. Yeah.
So if we could change gears a little bit, Sam, maybe we'll start to talk a little bit more about cross training and strength training, getting in the gym to enhance, your physical capability and that sort of stuff within the martial arts world, which again is something that you've got, decades of experience in. Maybe if you could just talk a little bit about, maybe from a beginner's point of view, or, someone that, what do you essentially think that the most important qualities are to begin training in someone's like early phases of weight training? And then maybe, if we could talk a little bit about how we would structure that.
And is it specific to combat athletes or just in general?
Maybe if we could just have a bit of a general chat in the beginning, and then if we could gear it a little bit towards combat athletes, that'd be cool.
Sure. So, if we're thinking about, I guess, sort of going back a few steps. So, if we're engaging in resistance training, we want to know why we're engaging in resistance training. So we want to have the goals of the intervention at the top of, the forefront of our minds. So, what I do, I sort of deal with people from anywhere from people that don't have any injuries, don't have any pain, don't necessarily have any physical goals, athletic goals or physicality goals, but they just want to live longer. They want to improve their bone health. They want to improve their balance. As they go into older age, they want to decrease their likelihood of falling. So you've got to look at, how does that goal match up to the intervention that you're using? Do people want to use resistance training as preparation for an athletic task, as an adjunct to improve athletic performance, or is it perhaps a body composition goal? Do people want to improve their muscularity, increase their muscle mass, decrease their body fat? So you need a goal to sort of work backwards from. Whenever we're starting off a resistance training program, we want to make sure that we have a baseline of how that person moves. And we could have you could do probably a podcast series on movement, and not every person, but there's some very different views in terms of, there's some people that would want an individual engaging in any sort of exercise to be working, to be moving perfectly symmetrically, and in a picture perfect way before they start training. There's, I guess, if you're looking at a diagram, a triangle, there's some people that would think that, technique, movement quality doesn't matter at all. You're just sort of working on building capacity. Another part of it, I guess, from a rehab perspective, is that it's actually better to train with as random or bigger variety in movement patterns as possible, because then you're actually training the capacity to perform those movement patterns under load, and you're developing yourself in as very variable a way as possible. But I think whatever way you're approaching that, you need to have an idea of how that person moves. For me, I am still probably slightly old school in that I want a person to have a certain amount of movement proficiency before allowing that variation to occur. And I think that part of that is if someone has a good range of movement proficiency, and is able to achieve what we would sort of talk about in terms of good technique, good form with the basic movement patterns, then they have an understanding of what their body feels like when they're in those positions, and then they can move out of those positions with greater ease, as long as they haven't sort of been ingrained into those positions, and that will help them achieve better overall movement capabilities. So you want to make sure that you have an idea of how someone looks when they squat, when they hinge, when they pull, when they push, when they're operating on one leg, and also having a look at their sort of joint structure and seeing where there may be some asymmetries, and not necessarily trying to make those asymmetries symmetrical, because in a lot of cases that's not going to be possible, but just being aware of them and including perhaps some modifications in the training process based on that. I think that when you're starting to apply load to the system, so I guess just going back to the movement, if you have an idea of how someone moves, and let's say someone has a very reduced hip flexion capacity in their squat, doesn't mean you're not going to start loading up the squat. You can start loading up that person through the range of motion in which they're able to control themselves, and then as that range of motion improves, if you feel that like that individual would benefit from improvement in that certain pattern in order to meet the goals that we've decided on before we commence this, then you might be working concurrently on whatever specific aspect it is, whether it's range of motion or movement or motor control, whilst concurrently loading them up in that range of motion that they are able to achieve. And you might find that someone moves very well in one pattern, so you can load that pattern up much faster and much earlier on in the training process, whereas with other patterns you might have to spend more time on working on movement quality. From there, I think it's important to look at using the minimum effective dose when you're training, because if you start off with too high a training load, then you're likely to reach a sort of ceiling in terms of your adaptations earlier on. So you want to start with by a minimal effective dose. Obviously, it's a term that's used in pharmacology. If you're taking a medicine, you want to take a medicine that's going to have the effect that you want to treat whatever ailment that we're using that medicine to treat, but you don't want to use too much that you're going to have a potentially deleterious effect and greater side effects. With training, you want the stimulus that's going to produce a response, an adaptation that you want. So if you want to improve your strength, you want to train with a load that's going to make those strength improvements, and you're using that minimal effective dose until it's no longer effective, at which stage you're then increasing the load that you're using. And so by load, we could be talking about the intensity of the exercise, the overall volume. There's obviously a lot of qualities and variables that can go into the programming and the resistance training program. I think if you start at the other end and you throw yourself in, and you're training more than is required, it can be easy to overload the system. And when you stop making those gains, you don't know whether it's actually that you're not training enough or training too much. Because at the end of the day, that's really what's going to drive the adaptations that you're making. If you're training and you're sleeping well, you're eating well, you're doing everything else that you should, and you're at a moderate level of training age, because once you get to a certain stage where you're probably not going to progress that much if you're at a high training age. If you've just started training, it's very easy to make gains. And then somewhere in the middle, if you're not making gains, you're probably training too much or too little. And if you start on the too little side and work up from there, it's much easier to gauge when you start to plateau that it's likely that you just need to increase the volume rather than deciding whether you need to increase or decrease. I think for beginners, like I said, we look at the movement patterns, the basic movement patterns. If there are things there which, in order to meet our goals, we feel like we can modify, then you would do that as part of the program, whether it's sort of mobility, flexibility training, and then work on developing capacity in your main movement patterns. So a lot of the time that's sort of squatting, hinging, using split squat, pushing, pulling in different directions. So a basic program for someone wanting to develop overall strength might include sort of squatting, deadlifting, split squatting, what we call a horizontal push, horizontal pull, so like a bench press and a row, and then some movements overhead depending on that person's mobility in that direction, so like a pull down, and then sort of an overhead press if they have the required mobility. And then you can basically increase the intensity and the complexity of those sort of movement patterns. When I'm programming for a beginner, I tend not to include that much accessory strength work. I think that even if you're looking at strength training as for body composition goals, and let's say you want to get jacked arms, I don't think that you need to throw yourself into a program that includes a lot of arm isolation work. I think if you spend a certain amount of time getting strong in more compound movements, that's going to give you the capacity to achieve that sort of arm hypertrophy later on, if that is your goal. But I think that just starting at the basics, moving well, using compound exercises, and concurrently improving your movement quality as you're improving your capacity in those movement patterns. So yeah, that's basically where I'd start. Where did you want to go from there? Because we can go in all sorts of different directions.
Yeah, I'm just looking across at your 500-page book on my bookshelf somewhere. I know we could talk about this stuff for a very long time, and I do want to break down some of these aspects a little bit more, Sam. So you're saying essentially for a beginner, you realistically you should be assessed by a health professional that can assess things like range of motion, joint range of motion, maybe flexibility, mobility, and they can have a look at your overall movement quality to see if there's any discrepancies there, whether that's from a stability or a strength point of view. And then essentially by building the base, maybe if we could talk a bit about base building, which you kind of touched on, or that GPP type approach, which is where we're just undergoing all the fundamental movement patterns. We're starting to build a bit of maybe hypertrophy, a bit of muscle mass. We're increasing our strength a little bit at the same time, particularly if we're like a newbie or a beginner. And then where would you say people can start to progress from there? So say, for example, someone's already been training in the gym for a couple of years. They've got a fairly good base. They're fairly proficient with their movement patterns, but maybe, they're still working in like the 8 to 12 rep range. They haven't really done too much strength stuff, or they haven't really done too much, multi-planar or kind of more explosive stuff in their training. So how would you progress someone then as a beginner with this base into someone, a little bit more advanced?
So it obviously depends on the person in front of you. That's an annoying answer for any question. It depends. But if I'm imagining someone that you're describing that has had a decent amount of strength training experience, and let's just say that they are a stand-up combat fighter, just take an example, because I think if you're dealing with like an MMA athlete where you're introducing elements of wrestling and takedowns and things like that, that starts to blur the picture quite a lot. So I think that you want to separate it a little bit in terms of your lower body training and upper body training. I think that in both in terms of strength and hypertrophy, I know one of your questions which you might get to later is resources and people I follow. The Boxing Science group, who are quite active on Instagram and YouTube, they've actually done a lot of research in themselves and looked at the correlation between different strength, hypertrophy measures, and punching power. And obviously, if we're talking about a stand-up athlete, that could even be broken down into does someone kick or does someone just use their hands. But even for someone who's only throwing punches, they've found that the leg and trunk musculature has the biggest correlation with the punching power. And I think that people in the sport intuitively probably understand that, or they should. People outside combat sports might think that a punch is mainly an upper body dominant movement. But if you're thinking about the biomechanics of it, when you're throwing a punch, your legs are having to overcome the ground to produce force. So your legs are having to push against your whole body weight to generate that ground reaction force to then transmit force up through the body. And as that process is happening, you're getting acceleration. So the speed at which that force is being transmitted from, let's say, your big toe up to your ankle and then up to your knee, and then by the time it gets your fist, it's increasing in velocity exponentially. So you need a lot more muscle mass, but also a lot more strength to try and overcome that inertia to generate force from the ground. Whereas by the time you get up into the upper body, you're focusing more on explosive speed. And so when you look at structuring an exercise program around that, I think that you can have a little bit more of a strength focus for the lower body, and then maybe a little bit more of a power focus for the upper body. So I think if someone's strength, let's say they're following a basic strength training program and their upper body and lower body strength is sort of improving concurrently, I would move into more power-based movements in the upper body a little bit quicker. And so, you can do that via a number of different means. I guess just talking about what power and explosiveness actually is, I think people, if you say that word, they understand inherently what is involved in being powerful. But power is basically a result of force and time. So it's the amount of force that you can produce divided by the time that you're producing that force in. And even more specifically, when you talk about the impulse of, especially in something like combat sports, where what we're trying to do for the most part is use our power to produce, to cause harm to the opponent. So we want to inflict pain. We're all very nice people, and we do this in a sportsmanlike manner. But at the end of the day, we're trying to hurt the person, and in order to hurt the person, we need to produce a certain amount of force in as little time as possible, in as smaller space as possible, to make that person hurt right there where we're punching. So you're looking at exercises that train those qualities. So if you're pulling a very, very heavy deadlift, a very, very heavy squat, you've got a lot of force, right? But you're doing it in a small amount of time. If you're jumping up in the air, or if you're throwing a light medicine ball, you're not producing anywhere as much force, but you're doing it in a much, much, much shorter time, so the power might be greater. And different athletes, and we call this the force velocity curve, different athletes will lie along that curve, and they might lie at different spots along that curve at different times in their career. Someone might get gradually more explosive, and then they might let's say they hit their late 20s or early 30s, and then they might start to go in the other direction. And it's still possible for someone to get stronger as they start to get older, but it's more difficult to get more explosive. And then it might also be a transient quality. So depending on if you're looking at periodizing someone's training plan, if you're trying to work on your max strength, then you might be further along that to the max strength side, the higher force, lower velocity side of that force velocity curve. And then maybe closer to the tournament, you might train with higher velocity type movements. So if we're taking a pulling movement, a deadlift would be an example of a high force, low velocity movement. Something like an Olympic lift, like a clean, is moving further along. And then something like a kettlebell swing or a vertical jump, a jump squat, something with weight might be further along. You're getting less, you're moving less load, but you're doing it quicker. And then something like an unweighted jump or a plyometric movement is up the other end. And so if you've got an athlete, you want to test those. And there's different ways to test them, depending on the equipment that you've got available to you and the resources and the coaching expertise. You can do a simple vertical jump test and see where you are relative to the average athlete of your age and size. And then you can do, say, a loaded deadlift or back squat and see where you are on the strength. And if one of those is out of whack, you might find that you need to train more on that aspect. You can measure different types of jumps. So if you're having a pause at the bottom of your jump and then jumping up, then you're using more of your force rather than the ballistic, the elastic qualities in the muscle and the tendon. Whereas if you if you do those two jumps, so if you sort of go from a static position and jump up, what we call a squat jump, or a counter movement jump where you dip back down and jump up, and if those are the same, then it shows that you're probably not very elastic, and you probably need to work a little bit more on that elasticity. Whereas if you're really springy, then it's probably a sign that you need to work a little bit more on your strength. So different athletes will need to include different amounts of power type training to achieve a similar amount of power development. And so that's sort of an example for the lower body. And then the upper body is the same. So you can be working the same sort of exercise. Let's just take the bench press as the most basic sort of upper body exercise. And let's say that you're working at 90% of your max 1RM, and you're doing sort of sets of 2 or 3, keeping a couple of reps in reserve, stopping short of failure. That's sort of a more of a strength protocol. And then you might drop that down to 60% and try and move that bar as fast as possible. And that's then moving it further along that force velocity curve. And then you can do medicine ball throws and explosive push-ups and things like that to take it even further along that continuum. You would start to introduce some of that work in. And so the way that I go about periodization is I always try and train as many elements as possible, but just with a specific focus on one. So even if someone is going through a hypertrophy phase and their resistance training sessions are mostly focused on high volume, moderate load training, you might still start the session with maybe just a few sets of explosive movements, and then maybe one heavily loaded movement, and then back off to your more sort of moderate loads. And then even if you're training for strength and you're using a lot of heavy loads, low repetitions, in order to, and you're not quite getting that volume in to maintain the hypertrophy that you've achieved in the previous block, you may sort of finish with a few down sets so that you are getting some volume. You're getting a little bit more mechanical tension and a little bit more sort of metabolic disturbance, which is going to drive some retention of the muscle qualities that you've achieved in the previous block of training. Does that sort of answer your question? Partly.
Yeah. You touched on like a lot of really great points in there. And again, you've got such a wealth of knowledge that some people might be a little bit overwhelmed hearing things of this. And if you are one of those people, I definitely recommend, going back and re-listening to certain bits and pieces of it. So some of the things that I'll kind of want to just touch on again then, Sam, that you spoke of is, again, so once we've done a little bit of base building, more hypertrophy stuff, we can bring in our strength power work from there. But essentially, it's sort of dependent on the athlete as to which end of that spectrum of the force velocity curve that they're going to focus. So if they're naturally a more explosive person, but they're not that strong, they might spend a bit more time in strength. And if they're naturally strong, but not that explosive, they might spend a little bit more time of their program in the explosive end. That's kind of correct, yeah?
Yeah. And I guess I didn't answer this. So the first part of your question is progressing from, if someone has done more of a basic, higher repetition type of protocol, then you'd start off by lowering those repetitions. So you just do sort of a linear progression, increase the loads, decrease the repetitions, so that someone is used to operating at a higher degree of force and is in particular used to activating their nervous system at a higher degree. Because if you're doing higher repetition training, your nervous system is going to be activated, I guess what we call higher order motor units are going to be activated later on in the set. And so you're not used to using as much of your sort of nervous system capacity as you would if you're using heavier weights. So you imagine if you're contracting a muscle, obviously people know that the nerves that come from your brain, from your nervous system, are activating those muscles. But you're not always, very rarely, you're never using that whole pool of nervous system capability. People have heard about the mother who lifts up the car to get the baby out from underneath. So we all have that sort of strength there, but for safety reasons, our nervous system, our brain doesn't allow us to use it. So part of resistance training is learning to use more of those channels. Imagine you've got a 10-lane highway. You might only be using one lane. We want to try and open up more of those lanes for some of that nervous system traffic to go through. And so in order to really maximize the effectiveness of a power training intervention, you want to be used to training with heavy loads and activating the nervous system so that whole system learns to function most effectively.
Yeah, cool. That's really cool. So would you say from a combat athlete's point of view, like a stand-up striking athlete's point of view, do you believe that we really have to focus, say, for example, less than a 3 RM, or should we work all sort of ranges of the rep spectrum from, say, like a 1 to 8 for our strength work?
Yeah, I think that you sort of got to weigh up the risk versus reward as well. there is, I think, a slightly higher inherent risk in doing maximal rep lifts. I think that even for testing, it's one of the things that I've sort of, there's a few things from the book that I would probably change or alter slightly. But in order to do that, I'd have to rewrite it, and I can't be bothered at this stage. But I think that even for testing, like a 3 to 5 rep range is really good. And I think that to be really good at 1 RMs and even 2 RMs, your technique has to be really dialed in to a point that I don't think combat athletes need to be quite at that level. And it's a lot of load for the nervous system. So I think that, probably 3 is as low as I'd go, even for testing for most things. I think for bench press, for upper body stuff, you can probably get away with less. But from a training perspective, I don't think you need to be doing that for the upper body. But for testing, you can probably get away with it. But for training for the lower body, I tend to sort of stick within that like 3 to 6 rep range.
Yeah, awesome. I think, I found a similar thing in my own training. It's like working in that sort of 3 to 8 rep range, 3 to 6 rep range has been beneficial. And again, you don't fatigue your nervous system so much that you can't recover then for your skills training, which I think is really important, especially for combat athletes, right? We've got to be quick and agile and, explosive still. So, awesome.
And I think, also, just because we are trying to maintain some tissue quality as well, some hypertrophy, the 6 reps is sort of a good number because you are actually getting enough mechanical tension in the muscle to to maintain some hypertrophy gains and even make some gains. On the research, 5 is starting to get on the lower end, but when you do 6 reps, you are accumulating enough volume at a close enough proximity to failure to make some hypertrophy adaptations. So, if someone wanted to sort of work on their strength but try to have a little bit of hypertrophy at the same time, the 6 reps works quite well. You're getting enough mechanical tension, but you're not inducing excessive fatigue.
And I think going back to, quickly going back to another point you made earlier, we can train multiple ends of this. Like we can train the whole range of the rep spectrum, right? The rep sort of number within a given workout session. So it's like you might start with your explosiveness, your strength stuff, and then you might kind of finish with some more higher volume, hypertrophy based stuff. So it's like, you can train all these qualities in one session, which is, I think, a lot of people just maybe want to focus on one. They go, I'm only doing hypertrophy at the moment, or I'm only doing strength or explosive work at the moment. But maybe if you could talk a little bit about to that point about how we might actually, from a practical point of view, actually structure our sessions as we want to focus on a bit more power and explosiveness. Yep,
sure. And I think that this is probably the biggest change that I made actually since writing the book is looking a little bit more of what we call a conjugate system of periodization, where you are trying to train different variables. I think that a block, so periodization is essentially just our planning of training, how we go about formulating taking our goals in terms of what we want from our training, in this case in resistance training, and putting it into practice. The traditional model of periodization is a sort of linear periodization where you target certain intensities, and you start with a lower intensity, higher volume, and then go to a higher intensity, lower volume, and then block periodization where you spend a certain amount of time training on a certain quality. Conjugate periodization is where you're trying to train different variables at the same time, and you can do this like a within session conjugate approach, or you could do it like within the training week. So and this is even sometimes used in powerlifting circles. The West Side Powerlifting Club and Louis Simmons are sort of famed for using this, where you might train sort of maximal efforts on one day, and then you might train more explosive efforts on another. But I tend to like to combine it all in one session. So practically how that might look, you might start, you start with a general warm-up, however that sort of looks for you. And then you might, as part of your warm-up, do some lighter loaded explosive movements like some jumps, some med ball throws, and things like that, and then progress into some heavier loaded explosive movements, let's say like a power clean or a push press or a push press, those sort of movements where you're sort of moving a little bit further along that spectrum, and that might be sort of the main part of your training session. And then as you sort of get towards the end of the training session, you might do a few sets of a more heavily loaded exercise. Let's say you're doing a superset between, say, a deadlift and a bench press. And then you might finish the session with some higher repetition isolation work. And that sort of might look similar from block to block, but just the amount of power training might be decreased and the amount of strength training increased depending on sort of what block you're in. You can also do some different methods in terms of using complex training. So complex training is where you actually combine different exercises for the same movement pattern on different ends of that spectrum in the same sort of set, if you like. So you might do a heavy bench press, you might do 3 repetitions at 90% of 1RM, and then you might wait a certain amount of time. Now, that amount of time that you need to wait is we still don't have a good understanding of where that is, both in terms of the acute. So what this does is basically create a potentiation effect. So if you do your bench press, really heavy bench press, not close enough to failure to cause fatigue, and then you go and throw a punch, you can make it skills specific like that, or you can go and do a medicine ball throw. That punch or medicine ball throw, if you allow enough recovery time, should be harder than had you not done the heavy bench press before. And the same as, if you do a heavy squat and then do a sprint, they've shown that you can increase your sprint time. What we don't have good evidence for at the moment is the long-term effectiveness of this. So we know that it produces an acute change, which in itself could be useful for training. I know as I got into this sort of towards the end of my career, I would actually do some plyometrics, like as the end part of my warm-up, like 15, 20 minutes before going out on the mat. I felt like that helped with my explosiveness. But yeah, we don't have good evidence at this stage whether that actually improves things in the long term. But I think it's still a useful way to train, and a lot of people like it. I think you feel a lot more explosive. So if you do a heavy bench press and then you do that medicine ball throw, it's like anything. If you're, you get that, I guess people can explain the potentiation effect. If you're walking along the conveyor belt at the airport and then you walk off, you feel like you're walking faster. It's that type of sensation. So a lot of people find it an enjoyable way to train. And you can also do the same thing with the same exercise. So you might do, again, let's just stick with bench press at 90%. For say 3 reps, and then wait a certain amount of time, and then do the same exercise at 60%, but try and move it as fast as possible. And again, you'll find that you feel like you can move it a little bit harder. And I've done sort of 3-way or even sort of 4-way sets where I do heavy bench press, lighter bench press, explosive push-up, and then punches against the bag. And I'm lucky to have a facility where I've got the weight room and the bags there. So that's another way that you can structure your power training. The other thing that I think is really popular now is velocity-based training. So velocity-based training is where you're measuring the velocity or the speed at which the implement that you're using is moving. And this used to be a really expensive exercise. The units that you could buy to measure this type of thing were a couple of $1,000s. Now you can buy, I say now, the one I bought was probably 2 years ago, and it was maybe $400. I'm sure they're much cheaper now. And they're also, so the one that I use is almost like the original brand of this was called a Tendo, but you basically attach a string that's attached to a little box. So when you move the bar, it'll tell you how quickly you're moving the bar. And it's very accurate, and it gives you real-time feedback. But I have devices now where you're basically setting up a camera, and the camera will take a measure of how fast the bar is moving. And with what's happening, even just in the last couple of weeks with AI and the advancements in tech and technology, which just seem to be happening exponentially, in 2 years, who knows how we'll be measuring the speed. But it's a very useful training tool. So if you're, it's a useful training tool for a number of different reasons. for motivation. So if you're doing power training and you're trying to move the bar or whatever implement it is as fast as you can, then having some real-time feedback, okay, move that at 0.75 meters a second. Let's see if I can beat that. And it's giving you real-time feedback. It can also help both with power training in the sense that if you're doing, say, power cleans and you want to keep it at a certain velocity, rather than just doing a certain amount of weight, you're doing or certain number of reps, you're doing as many reps as you can before that velocity decreases by a certain amount. So let's say you're working a certain resistance and you want to cease your set once it drops by 20%. It'll give you that reading. Once you start to slow down, then you finish the set there. And the same with strength training. If you want to keep a certain number of repetitions in reserve. So we're talking about not training to failure, which I think we could again have another whole podcast about. But I think in particular for non-strength sport athletes, and especially combat sports athletes, where what we do is very fatiguing and very we're using a lot of the glycolytic system. So we're using a lot of the glucose stores in our body, which can be very fatiguing. Just in our skills training, we don't want to do too much of that when we're in the weight room. So training to failure in every set, which inherently is what people want to do. It's I can do 10 reps. Why wouldn't I want to do 10 reps? I want to push myself as hard as I can. But that doesn't actually necessarily lead to the best long-term training, especially when you're doing it in combination with other sports. So what they've found is that most individuals will have a fairly standard strength speed curve. So once they get close to their maximum number of reps, then the speed will drop off at the same rate. So I know myself, my bench press, if I'm doing a grinding 1RM, it'll be at about 0.09 meters per second. The rep before that will be 0.13. The rep before that will be 0.17. So if I want to stop 2 reps before failure, then I'm sort of looking for my speed to drop below that 0.17 and then cease the set there. And that's really useful because depending on what's going on with our training, with what's going on with our lives, whether we've had a bad couple of nights sleep or we're stressed, our strength levels can vary dramatically. So just putting the same amount of weight on the bar as you did last week or 2 weeks ago and expecting to feel the same or better at the same number of repetitions isn't always realistic. And velocity belt-based training helps circumvent that because you're not so worried about, you're training at the same intensity regardless of how you feel and the weight that you're using. And that's a really good way to sort of structure your training. So yeah, I can't even remember what the original question was, but we veered way off track there. But hopefully that'll be of interest to people.
Yeah, that's completely fine, Sam. I think everything, even if we go off on these little tangents, it's still we're talking about really valuable things. And yeah, again, like you said, I think that velocity of the bar throughout your lifts, that is really a key marker, isn't it, as to how many, like you said, how many reps in reserve you actually have. And I suppose that's something that we each have to learn as individuals, how close are we to failure in our set, so we know we're actually, again, giving the body enough stimulus to get a change.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. So we'll just be mindful of time here, Sam. You've got about 10 to 15 minutes more. Is that correct, mate?
Yeah, about 10 minutes. Yeah. Wow, that's gone quick.
Cool. Yeah, going really quick. Maybe we'll just do, if you can do maybe a little bit more kind of rapid fire type questions. I'm looking at one of the questions here. It's it's not a rapid fire one, but maybe if you can give a 1 minute answer on tapering. And as we're getting closer to an event, how do we know how to taper effectively?
So I think it's, in my experience, a little bit of trial and error because some people don't really need to taper at all, and then some people really need to back off. So I've had people that will go into a tournament with like a 2-day taper. They really don't taper off at all. That works well for them. I know people that have to back off for a month. So I think that experimenting, if you're new to competition, experimenting with different tapering techniques, I guess the stock standard recommendations is about a 40 to 50%, up to 60% reduction in training volume. but a maintenance of training intensity. And you can do that by a linear tapering, where you gradually taper off over those and it's over 2 weeks. 10 days to 14 days is the standard. Decreasing the volume, maintain the intensity, or you can do it a step taper. So you might do a slightly lower for a couple of days and then slightly lower for maybe the next 3 days. But we don't really have good data for tapering in combat sports, and I think it differs as well depending on what sort of combat sport you're in, and this is sort of affects the whole periodization. Because if you're doing karate and you've got the calendar right now, it's 20th of January, you know that you've got a state tournament in April, you've got a national tournament in September, and then you've got a world tournament in December, then it's a lot easier to structure your program. If you're fighting more in individual combat sports where you're doing individual fights, so boxing, kickboxing, MMA for the most part are structured like that, you could have a fight come up in sort of 3 weeks, and you've got to sort of vary your periodization. And if you've got 3 weeks to prepare for a fight, you probably can't taper for 2 weeks. And I know my master's supervisor, Greg Haff, who was the former president of the NSCA, he always used to say, there's a lot of athletes that just don't need to taper because you actually got to be training hard enough to warrant a taper or to deserve a taper. But you've got to have that base level of training for a taper to actually be effective. You can monitor things and again, the technology is allowing it to be much easier to monitor things like resting heart rate, sleep quality, heart rate variability, heart rate recovery in between rounds. And so knowing what variables are conducive to your best performance. So if you have a really good sparring session, what does your heart rate variability, where are you sort of in your physiological peak? And then try your different taping methods and see if you can equate that to your performance. And you probably need to do it with different things rather than how did you perform in a tournament, because so many factors can influence that. The biggest one of those is the opponent that you're against. Did you lose that fight because your tapering was off by 3 days, or did you use that fight because your opponent was just much better? It's difficult to base your tapering experience off tournament results alone. So I think you need to have some sort of physiological performance metric that you can base your readiness for competition on, and then adjust your taper based on that. Sorry, that wasn't rapid fire at all.
I think that, again, there's so many tools out there these days, right? You got basic measurement device, heart rate variability, blood pressure, these Aura rings and all these sort of stuff that's out there that can tell you about how you're recovering. So it's cool to see the technology, change and catch up. So maybe if we can just go with, again, we'll try and finish with these rapid fire questions. I'll give you maybe 20 or 30 seconds for each question, Sam. How does that sound?
I'll do my best.
All right. What have you changed your mind on over your career, mate? And we'll start there. What have you changed your mind on?
Periodization. So 2 things. Periodization, I think there's a bigger role for conjugate periodization, particularly with those one-fight combat athletes that are having to fight at short notice and unpredictable schedule. And also probably changed my thoughts on the importance of bent my opinions on the importance of movement quality and technique, not by a large degree, but I'm probably not as strict and stringent as I used to be.
Yeah, cool. Maybe some open chaining exercises as well, hey?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Oh, wow. That was probably the biggest thing I've changed my mind on. I used to put knee extensions in the same category as like parking attendants and cockroaches. I just thought they were the devil. And now I use them with pretty much every client, and especially every knee patient. So there you go.
Yeah. I had a similar effect myself. I had like a bit of a knee problem, and actually just doing some single leg knee extensions actually really helped it a lot. So
sure.
Yeah, no, this is cool. Awesome. What would you go back and give your 18-year-old self as a piece of advice?
Just be patient and be thorough. There you
go. Beautiful. 3 most influential people in your life?
I'm going to be boring and say my mum, my dad, and my wife. But then if, I guess, in terms of combat and karate, Xian Peter Volk, Andrew Harisiu, who was sort of my mentor when I was at university. I was living in Melbourne and I was training with him a lot. And Tsukamoto. So there's, I guess, 6. And then probably one other who I haven't really spoken much about, but a colleague that I had when I was working at my previous practice, Annette Chase. Doesn't have anything to do with the combat sports world, but she was a very good sports physio. I'm sure she still is a very good sports physio. But she came over at a time when I was working at this practice where the management, they ran the business. So they ran the business well, but they weren't so focused on physiotherapy. And because I was a new grad, they were the ones that were sort of mentoring me and training me, and I wasn't sort of getting that exposure to really good physiotherapy knowledge. And so she came out to Japan and started working with us, and she sort of made me realize how far behind I was in my knowledge, and she sort of really sparked that education fire for me, and that's sort of been going ever since. So that was in 2009, and that sort of flicked a switch and really got me inspired about learning as much as I can about this whole profession.
Yeah, beautiful. Let's go with a few of your favourite practitioners, maybe within the strength and conditioning or the rehab world.
Sure. So I follow a lot of people, and some people are more specific to me as a practitioner. For your viewers and listeners, I think some people, if you want general rehab stuff, the E3 Rehab group on Instagram and YouTube are really good. I'm trying to be as general as possible because rehab can be a very polarized world to get into. So there might be some people on one end of the spectrum that I follow, but I'm following it with an appreciation with people on the other end of the spectrum. So, I could say like physiotherapists like Lorimer Mosley, who's very into the psychological side of things. But if you followed him, alone and only went down that rabbit hole, you probably wouldn't get as a broader view on rehab and injury management. So I think the E3 rehab guys are really good. David Joyce he's worked in a lot of professional sports, not combat sports, but he's worked in rugby, soccer, AFL, rugby league, but he has done a couple of books where he's collaborated with other practitioners. So high performance training for sports is a really good one, and he's got a lot of different experts. And if you read through that book and you like the style of the people that are in there, then sort of going on and following those. One of the authors in that book is Nick Winkelman, who he's a really good sports scientist and coach, and he's basically changed the game in terms of cueing and how the cues that we use for athletes can help change their performance and how and can change how they relate to a certain task. And I've found this useful not only in coaching resistance training, but also coaching skills training and coaching combat, and how you're sort of visualizing performing a movement and trying to improve your performance in those movements. So those are probably and then Mike Boyle is probably his podcast is the first podcast I ever listened to, and he's a fairly rounded strength coach. He's a bit controversial, and there's some people that don't like him, but I think if you were to follow him, you get a fairly good sort of base of strength and conditioning knowledge. In terms of combat sports specific stuff, as I've mentioned, the Boxing Science Group, anything that the UFC Performance Institute puts out, they've got a lot of resources behind them. They tend to put a lot of money into their Performance Institute. They don't tend to put a lot of money into paying their fighters, which is why they start to lose their fighters. But they actually put out pretty much a book that's actually free to download from their site, which has got a lot of the sort of metrics and the training systems and monitoring and stuff that they use. And they updated it after 2 years, and the last update was amazing, and I'm sure the next one will be even better. So anything by them, that's headed up by an English guy called Duncan French. Phil DeRue is a strength and conditioning coach in Florida who was the S&C coach at American Top Team. He's worked with guys like Dustin Poirier and Joanna Jędrzejczyk. He puts out, and he's been, I think, 3 times strength and conditioning coach in the World MMA Awards. And he's also very open. Like I've been lucky enough to get direct communication with him, and he's very generous with his time. He has a podcast, and he's very active on social media. And then I just remembered someone else, Jeffrey Chu, who is another combat sports S&C coach who puts out some great information as well. And I'm just you said a few books and podcasts. I've mentioned some of that as I've gone through. Science for Sport is a good podcast. It's quite basic in terms of the information they put out. They don't overly complicate things, but it gives a fairly well-rounded information on different topics. I've mentioned that. The Language of Coaching, Nick Winkelmann's book. High Performance Training, before I mentioned that. EUFCPI. And then I'd be foolish if I didn't mention the Science of Striking as an important resource, which I spent about 4 years writing, and so released that about 4 years ago. And that's basically the blueprint for how I went about my programming at that time. It hasn't changed a whole lot, but if you sort of read through that and you find it helpful, and you're interested in how I sort of have varied my training processes since then I'm always happy to communicate with people directly. As you can tell, I really enjoy talking shop and chatting about this stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful, Sam. Again, for anyone that's, I do recommend your book for a lot of people that we get chatting to. I get chatting to, and they're inside the world of karate or combat sports. And really, for anyone that hasn't had a look at Sam's book, it's massive. What is it? 400 to 500 pages.
Something like that, yeah.
He covers everything. Breaks down assessment, injury, physiology, basic programming, periodization. So a lot of the stuff that we talked about in today's chat. So Sam breaks that down in immense detail. So I highly recommend that book. Awesome, Sam. Where can people find you online, mate? If people want to connect with you or follow you or your podcast?
Yeah, I'm probably most active on Instagram. So if you just go to Sam_Gilbert_Tokyo, usually posting stuff on there every day. Some of it's sort of sports performance and rehab related. Some of it is related to sort of my business life here in Tokyo. As you said, I run a podcast called the Tokyo Living Podcast, which, again, there's some injury-specific and exercise-specific stuff there. If you're just also interested about sort of life in Tokyo and what other people are doing in sports and other martial arts in Tokyo, I've got a few martial artists on there, and a few other things that are just relevant to general health, not necessarily Tokyo specific. And then just stuff about my kids and my family, and a bit about me as a person. But it's probably the easiest place to find me. Sam_Gilbert_Tokyo. If for those people that are interested in if they are sort of trainers or health practitioners, we do also have the Club 360 Academy, where we have certain courses on programming, on coaching, on sort of training around injuries, mobility. We've got courses around kettlebell technique. If you go to club360academy.com, and if you have a look at those courses, and if you are interested in purchasing them, contact me directly, and I can give listeners a 50% off code for any of the courses on that website there. The book is available on Amazon. So you just search The Science of Striking. And then I also have a website, thescienceofstriking.com. I haven't been as active on that of late, but I guess during the pandemic, when I had a little bit more time on my hands, I was just spending a lot of time looking at combat sports specific research and breaking down a lot of the studies. So most combat sports science related studies from between 2020 and 2022, I've got sort of some breakdowns on there, and just some random blog posts and things like that. So yeah, they're the best places to find me. And if you want to contact me directly, you can sort of DM me on Instagram, or just contact me at sam@club360.jp.
Awesome, Sam. So if you can send me some of those links to your academy and that sort of stuff, I'll pop everything in the show notes, and I'll link, your website, your book, your Instagram, all that sort of stuff in the show notes too. So very big thank you for your time today, Sam. Very much appreciated, and I had a blast.
You're welcome. No, thank you very much for having me on. Like I said, I always enjoy chatting about this sort of stuff. And again, congratulations on the podcast, and good luck with what you decide to do with the show going forward.
Thanks very much, Sam.
Yes.